All right, welcome to lesson 2 of your first podcast episode of Crash Course. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the different types of podcasts. So, we'll start off with solo podcasts. Solo podcasts are typically one person monologuing or sharing their thoughts with their audience. Again, this can vary in length, but it's typically the easiest podcast type to get started, mainly because it doesn't require a lot of setup and preparation. During this course, you'll be producing your first solo podcast. That is what we will be focusing on in this course to help you create your first solo podcast episode. After you've learned and gone through this course, you can figure out whatever other types of podcasts you want to do. But just to get started, to get your feet wet and to build up your confidence, we're going to focus on the solo podcast for you. The next type of podcast you have is team podcasts, which include 2 or more people. These podcasts are super fun to listen to because the audience typically has the opportunity to sit in on the conversation between a group of friends. Setting up a team podcast can be a little more challenging, but with the right technology, it's pretty simple to do. During the whole COVID pandemic situation, when everyone was social distancing, a lot of podcasts turned to tools like Zoom or StreamYard, a streaming platform tool, to continue to produce their shows. So there's all kinds of creative ways to continue to record your podcast, especially with team podcasts. There's technology to help you record with your friends, family, or your podcast show hosts at a distance. The next type of podcasts are interview-based podcasts. Interview-based podcasts are similar to team podcasts, but the focus is usually a host asking questions to a particular guest. This setup is one of the faster growing podcast styles because you, as a podcast creator, can leverage the audience and knowledge of your guests. You don't have to depend so heavily on yourself, for example, a solo podcast, or on how interesting you and your friends are in regards to like the team podcast. Interview-based podcasts, if you like asking people questions, if you have like a journalistic kind of bent, interview-based podcasts could be the thing that you would want to further pursue after you've gone through this crash course to learn how to do your first solo podcast episode. The next type of podcast that we have is story fiction type podcasts. So story fictional type podcasts are ones that are more difficult podcasts to create, mainly due to the audience base. For this type of podcast, all you typically need is a good story and someone to read it, whether it's you narrating the story or you're working with voice actors to narrate a story. These podcasts are fun to listen to and also fun to make, especially if you're interested in producing audiobooks at some point as an author or as a voice actor. The next type of podcasts are informational, news, or documentary style podcasts. This type of podcast can be as simple as reading news articles and commenting on them, or as complex as combining interviews, news reports, audio reels, and sound design. A wonderful documentary type podcast is the 1619 Project that was released in 2020. The production of this type of podcast can require a decent budget, but will be well worth it if you have a supportive audience and also sponsors. The next type of podcasts are audio dramas. This is probably one of my favorite types of podcasts. Audio dramas are different than the story fiction category of podcasts because they are full-blown productions. Think of a movie, but only using sound. Audio dramas usually have multiple actors, directors, script writers, audio producers that handle sound design, and even a music director or team to handle the score. Audio dramas can be a really big deal, but they are super fun to listen to. And the last common type of podcast that you can hear out there that you could eventually probably produce for yourself is music podcasts. Music podcasts are typically DJs or producers putting together a mix or music set and sharing it with their audience. The challenging part with producing a music podcast is potentially having to deal with copyright infringement. You definitely don't want any legal trouble when producing your podcast for any reason, especially music. That's why there are tools and resources for you to get free licensed music for your podcast. Copyright infringement is a big deal and something that's being cracked down heavily, especially in the digital production space, so like YouTube or podcasts and things like that. Now that you have a little bit more information about the different types of podcasts, next we're going to move on to why it's important that you should start your own podcast and why it's important that you get through this crash course so that you can make your podcast. See you in the next lesson.